The heavy mahogany doors of the International Court creaked open as Ibrahim Traoré stepped inside, his military boots echoing against polished marble floors. Afternoon sunlight filtered through tall colonial-style windows, casting long shadows across packed wooden benches filled with journalists, diplomats, and curious observers. The air hummed with nervous anticipation, thick with the weight of history about to unfold. Whispers in French, English, and local languages created a symphony of tension that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. Camera flashes flickered like lightning, capturing every subtle expression on the young leader's weathered face. The scent of old leather and expensive cologne mixed with the dry heat of late afternoon in the capital. Judge Thomas sat elevated behind his imposing desk, his silver hair gleaming under fluorescent lights as he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. His pale fingers drummed methodically against the dark wood, each tap echoing like a countdown in the hushed courtroom. Years of prestigious education and connections to powerful Western interests had prepared him for this moment. The weight of his black robes seemed to amplify his authority as he cleared his throat with deliberate precision. Behind him hung flags of various nations, their colors somehow appearing muted in the tense atmosphere. His cold blue eyes fixed on Traoré with the intensity of a predator studying its prey. Ibrahim Traoré. Judge Thomas's voice cut through the silence like a blade, each word carefully enunciated with British precision. This court finds you guilty of destabilizing international economic partnerships and violating sovereign debt agreements. The room held its collective breath as phones recorded every syllable of this historic moment. You are hereby ordered to pay a fine of $500 million United States dollars within 60 days. Gasps rippled through the crowd like waves crashing against a shore during a violent storm. The number hung in the air like smoke from extinguished flame, choking the very life from a room. Even the court reporter's fingers seemed to hesitate over her keyboard, struggling to capture such an unprecedented judgment. But Ibrahim Traoré remained perfectly still, his dark eyes never leaving the judge's face as chaos erupted around him. His hands rested calmly on the defendant's table, showing no tremor, fear, or anger despite the crushing weight of the verdict. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth, confusing reporters who expected outrage or desperation from the young African leader. The fluorescent lights above seemed to flicker, as if responding to the electric tension crackling between the two men. In that moment, something shifted in the courtroom's atmosphere, like the calm before a thunderstorm that would change everything. History would remember this not as an ending, but as a spark that ignited an unexpected revolution. Ibrahim Traoré rose slowly from his chair, the screech of metal against marble floor cutting through the courtroom's chaotic murmur. His military uniform, pressed and dignified despite the circumstances, seemed to command respect even in this moment of apparent defeat. The red beret on his head caught the light, a symbol of revolution that had guided Burkina Faso through its darkest hours. Journalists leaned forward, cameras zooming in, expecting to capture the breakdown of Africa's youngest revolutionary leader. Instead, they witnessed something that would puzzle analysts for weeks to come. His expression remained serene, almost peaceful, like a man who possessed knowledge that others could not fathom. Your Honor, Traoré spoke in perfect English, his voice carrying the quiet strength of ancient baobab trees, weathering desert storms. Each word was measured, deliberate, without a trace of the anger or desperation everyone expected to hear. I respect this court's decision and will comply with all legal requirements within the specified time frame. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft whir of air conditioning and distant traffic. From the busy streets outside, Judge Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his confident demeanor flickering like a candle in sudden wind. Even as legal assistants exchanged confused glances, clearly unprepared for such gracious acceptance of what should have been a devastating blow. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of supporters had gathered despite police barriers and international security concerns surrounding the controversial trial. Their chants of Sankara lives in Africa, united, created a rhythmic drumbeat that seemed to pulse through the building's thick walls. When news of the fine reached them, an eerie quiet fell over the crowd like morning mist over the Volta River. Women wrapped in colorful, traditional fabrics clutched their children closer, while elderly men stroked their beards thoughtfully. The silence spoke louder than any protest could have, carrying the weight of centuries of injustice. Their leader's calm response had somehow transmitted itself to them, creating an unspoken understanding that this was merely another chapter in their long struggle. As Traoré walked toward the courthouse exit, his security detail flanking him with professional precision, something extraordinary happened in that marble corridor. Each step he took seemed to echo with increasing resonance, as if the building itself was amplifying his presence. The fluorescent lights above appeared brighter, the colonial portraits on the walls somehow less imposing in his wake. Reporters scrambled to ask questions, but he moved with the quiet dignity of a man who understood that actions speak louder than words. In his pocket, a worn photograph of Thomas Sankara reminded him that true revolution requires patience, strategy, and perfect timing. The real battle was just beginning. Judge Thomas retreated to his private chambers, loosening his black robes as the weight of the afternoon's proceedings settled on his shoulders. The mahogany paneled room rare of old, money and inherited privilege, with oil paintings of colonial administrators watching from gilded frames. His hands trembled slightly as he poured aged whiskey into a crystal tumbler, the amber liquid catching light from his antique desk lamp. On his mahogany desk lay a leather portfolio containing documents that would never see the light of any courtroom. The silence was broken only by the gentle tick of a grandfather clock, counting down moments until his encrypted phone would inevitably ring. His pale reflection in the window showed a man carrying burdens heavier than judicial robes. The phone shrilled. Tone cut through the evening air precisely at 7 o'clock as Thomas had expected. It would. "The judgment has been delivered," he spoke into the receiver, his voice lacking the authority it had commanded just hours earlier. A cultured French accent responded from the other end, smooth as silk, yet sharp as a blade, cutting through African sovereignty. "Excellent work, Thomas. The mining consortium will be pleased with your judicial interpretation of international law." Through his window, the lights of the capital city twinkled like stars, each one representing lives affected by decisions made in rooms like this. The conversation continued in hush, tones discussing transfer payments and offshore accounts with the casualness of men ordering dinner. Behind Thomas's judicial confidence lay decades of carefully cultivated relationships with European financial institutions and multinational corporations. His law degree from Oxford had opened doors, but his willingness to serve certain interests had kept him wide open throughout his career. The $500 million fine wasn't about justice. It was about sending a message to any African leader who dared challenge Western economic dominance. File cabinets in his office contained similar cases, each one a stepping stone in a career built on maintaining colonial power structures. His appointment to the International Court hadn't been based on merit alone, but on his proven reliability in protecting certain investments. The weight of compromise had long ago replaced any idealistic notions about blind justice. As midnight approached, Thomas stared at photographs on his desk, showing his children at prestigious European universities, their future secured by his judicial decisions. The irony wasn't lost on him that his comfortable lifestyle was built on perpetuating the very systems that kept entire continents impoverished. His whiskey glass sat empty now, but the bitter taste in his mouth came from sources far deeper than alcohol. Outside, the city slept peacefully, unaware that their fate had been decided not by law, but by backroom deals and colonial contracts. In his desk drawer, a resignation letter remained unfinished, written during moment of conscience that never seemed to last. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking another day in a career that history would judge far differently than any court. In the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, news of the $500 million fine spread faster than Hermiton winds across the Sahel. Market women pause there, haggling over militant tomatoes, their weathered faces creasing with disbelief, as radio broadcasts crackled through portable speakers. Children playing football with makeshift balls of plastic. Bags stopped mid-kick, sensing the gravity in their elders' sudden silence. The afternoon heat seemed to intensify as crowds gathered around any device that could carry the shocking verdict from the distant courthouse. Motorcycle. Taxi drivers pulled over, their engines cooling as they listened to reporters describe their president's impossible financial burden. The familiar sounds of daily life. Honking horns, bleating goats. Vendors' calls gradually faded into an eerie quiet. Weimer, a seamstress with callous hands from decades of intricate embroidery, set down her needle as tears welled. In her dark eyes, "They want to break us again," she whispered to her neighbor, her voice carrying the pain of generations who had watched foreign powers drain their homeland dry. Around her small shop, bolts of vibrant African fabric seemed to lose their brilliance as the weight of injustice settled over the community. Young men who had found hope in Traoré's revolution clenched their fists, their dreams of true independence suddenly feeling more distant than ever. The local mosque call to prayer echoed across tin rooftops, but even the imam's voice seemed heavy with sorrow. Women who had named their newborns after the young leader now wondered what future awaited these children in the university district. Students abandoned their evening classes to gather in the central courtyard beneath ancient baobab trees. Their smartphones glowed in the gathering darkness as they shared videos and updates trying to make sense of the judgment that defied all logic. Professor Kabor, a respected historian who had lived through multiple coups and foreign interventions, climbed onto a concrete bench to address the growing crowd. "This is not about money, my children," his aged voice carried across the silence. "This is about keeping Africa on its knees." The students listened with intensity that comes only from witnessing history unfold in real time. Electric generators hummed in the distance, providing sporadic light as the city prepared for what felt like a defining moment. As night fell over Burkina Faso, something extraordinary began to happen in villages across the country where electricity was scarce and news traveled by word of mouth. Elders who remember the days of Thomas Sankara gathered their communities around flickering fires, their voices weaving stories of resistance and dignity. Young people with motorcycles became messengers carrying updates between isolated settlements where hope had been reborn under True's leadership. The $500 million fine, impossible for their small nation to pay, somehow unified rather than divided them in their shared understanding of injustice. In every compound, from mud brick homes to concrete structures, the same quiet determination began to take root. The people sensed that their leader's calm response meant something deeper was stirring, like underground rivers preparing to surface. In the quiet town of Bordeaux, France, an elderly archivist named Marie Dubois worked late into the evening, her arthritic fingers carefully turning yellowed pages in a restricted colonial archive. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she discovered a file that made her blood run cold, documents bearing the signature of Judge Thomas's grandfather, Colonel Henry Thomas. The papers detailed mining concessions and forced labor contracts that had stripped West Africa of its wealth for generations. Her reading glasses fogged with emotion as she realized the current judge's family fortune was built on the same exploitation he now perpetuated. Outside, rain pelted the archive windows, like tears from history itself. The connection between past and present suddenly became crystal clear in the musty silence of forgotten records. Meanwhile, in his London penthouse, Judge Thomas stared at a portrait of his distinguished ancestor, the colonial administrator who had civilized Upper Var decades earlier. The oil painting depicted a stern man in military uniform, standing proudly beside African chiefs, forced to sign treaties they couldn't read. Thomas had grown up hearing heroic stories of his grandfather's service to the empire, never questioning the source of his family's inherited wealth. His Oxford education, his children's private schools, his judicial appointments, all fruits of a poison tree planted in African soil. The crystal chandelier. Above cast fractured light, across mahogany furniture purchased with blood. Money, even his prestigious law career, was built on networks established through his grandfather's colonial connections. Hidden in a Swiss bank vault, documents dating back to 1932 detailed how the Thomas family had secured exclusive mining rights through violence and intimidation. Colonel Henry Thomas had personally overseen the displacement of entire villages to access gold deposits that would fund European development. The same mining consortium that now employed Judge Thomas had been established using his grandfather's stolen African resources. Corporate records showed an unbroken chain of exploitation spanning nearly a century, with each generation of the Thomas family maintaining their grip on African wealth. The modern judge's harsh verdicts against African leaders weren't about justice. They were about protecting a criminal legacy. Bank statements revealed millions in payments to Thomas family trusts, all originating from African mineral extraction. In the basement of the International Court building, a junior clerk named David accidentally discovered misfiled correspondence between Judge Thomas and mining executives. The emails discussed neutralizing the Troll threat and maintaining traditional economic partnerships with language that barely concealed their colonial intentions. David's hands shook as he realized he held evidence of judicial corruption at the highest levels. The timestamps showed these conversations had occurred weeks before Traoré's trial, proving the verdict was predetermined by corporate interests. His grandmother had fled Burkina Faso during the colonial period, and her stories of suffering suddenly took on new meaning. In the dim basement, light, surrounded by legal documents and forgotten files, David understood he possessed the power to expose generations of injustice. In a small, mud brick compound on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, 90-year-old grandmother Aminata sat beneath her favorite baobab tree, its ancient trunk scarred by decades of Hamadan winds. Her granddaughter Miriam rushed toward her with tears streaming down her face, clutching a radio that had just broadcast news of the devastating find. Groar, they want to destroy our president with money we don't have. Miriam sobbed, falling to her knees on the dusty ground. The old woman's weathered hands, marked by a lifetime of grinding millet and weaving cloth, gently touched her granddaughter's trembling shoulders. Around them, the compound's chickens pecked at scattered grain, oblivious to the crisis unfolding in their human world. Aminata's clouded eyes seemed to look beyond the present moment into memories that stretch back to colonial times. Child, Aminata's voice carried the weight of decades, soft yet unshakable like desert sand, shaped by persistent winds. I have seen this story before. Her wrinkled fingers traced patterns in the red earth as she spoke, creating symbols that seemed to hold ancient meaning. When the white judges came in my youth, they always used papers and numbers to steal what bullets could not take. The afternoon sun filtered through baobab leaves, casting dancing shadows across her traditional indigo robes. Miriam listened intently, her sobs gradually quieting as wisdom older than the independent struggles began to unfold. The radio crackled with distant voices, but the old woman's words seemed to carry more truth than any news broadcast. Your President Ibrahim understands something these foreign judges do not. Aminata continued, her voice growing stronger with each word like a river swelling during rainy season. True power doesn't come from their courtrooms or their banks, but from the hearts of people who refuse to bow. She pointed toward the horizon, where other compounds dotted the landscape, each one home to families who had survived colonialism, coups, and countless hardships. Thomas Sankara taught us that dignity cannot be purchased or finded away. It lives in here. She tapped her chest with surprising force. The evening breeze carried the center with smoke and cooking millet. Reminders of life continuing despite impossible circumstances. Her granddaughter's tears had stopped, replaced by growing understanding of deeper truths. Mark my word, child, Aminata prophesied, her voice taking on an otherworldly quality that made even the roosting chickens pause their scratching. When the strong tried to crush the righteous with unjust laws, the ancestors awakened to restore balance. She reached into her worn leather pouch and pulled out a small piece of iron, smooth and dark from generations of handling. This was your great-grandfathers from the resistance against the French. It reminds us that what appears impossible today becomes tomorrow's victory. Miriam took the iron piece, feeling its warmth and weight in, her palm like a promise passed down through time. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, both women sat in comfortable silence, knowing that justice delayed is never justice denied. The grandmothers' prophecy would echo through the coming days, spreading from compound to compound like seeds carried by desert winds. In the glass towers of Brussels, European Union officials gathered in an emergency session as news of the $500 million fine dominated international headlines. The conference room buzzed with nervous energy as diplomats realized that Traoré's calm acceptance had backfired spectacularly on their carefully orchestrated plan. French Foreign Minister Claire Rousseau paced behind her chair, her designer heels clicking against polished floors as she fielded angry calls from Parisian mining executives. The African Union is calling for an emergency summit, she announced, her voice tight with barely concealed panic. Outside the towering windows, Brussels traffic moved in, orderly patterns, oblivious to the diplomatic crisis unfolding 40 floors above. The fine that was supposed to Burkina Faso was instead mobilizing half a continent against European interests. At the United Nations headquarters in New York, Secretary General Antonio Silva found his office overwhelmed, with calls from African leaders demanding immediate intervention. Ghana's president had already announced a solidarity fund, while Nigeria promised to cover fine entirely, if necessary, to protect African sovereignty. The ornate UN chamber echoed with passionate speeches as ambassador after ambassador condemned the verdict as economic colonialism disguised as justice. Social media exploded with hashtags like 500 million, strong in Africa rising, trending globally as diaspora communities organized protests outside European embassies. Silva's assistant brought him coffee with trembling hands, understanding that the wrong decision here could fracture international relations for decades. The marble halls that had witnessed countless diplomatic crises now faced their greatest test of legitimacy. In London's financial district, emergency board meetings convened as market analysts warned of potential African resource boycotts that could cost European corporations billions. The mining consortium that had orchestrated Judge Thomas's verdict watched their stock prices plummet as ethical investors fled in droves. Banking executives who had celebrated the fine just hours earlier now scrambled to distance themselves from what global media was calling judicial terrorism. Protesters gathered outside the London Stock Exchange, their chants of hands off Africa growing louder with each passing hour. Prime Minister Harrison's office received dozens of calls from Commonwealth nations threatening to reconsider their economic partnerships. The backroom deals that seemed so clever in darkness were crumbling under the harsh light of international scrutiny. From Moscow to Beijing, world powers watched the unfolding crisis with calculating eyes. Recognizing an opportunity to challenge Western dominance in Africa, Russian President Volov publicly offered to pay Burkina Faso's fine in exchange for expanded military cooperation agreements. China's state media launched a coordinated campaign highlighting European hypocrisy, contrasting their colonial history with China's infrastructure investments across Africa. In Thran, Supreme Leader Cam declared the verdict proof of Western legal system corruption, calling for a new international court free from colonial influence. The $500 million fine intended to isolate one small African nation, had instead isolated the entire Western judicial system. As evening fell across different time zones, it became clear that Judge Thomas's verdict had triggered a global realignment that no one had anticipated. In the dimly lit basement of the International Court, David's heart pounded as he photographed the damning correspondence between Judge Thomas and mining executives with his smartphone. Each email revealed layers of corruption that stretched back decades, connecting courtroom verdicts to corporate boardrooms in ways that violated every principle of judicial independence. His hands trembled as he scrolled through messages discussing African containment strategies and judicial solutions to resource access problems. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously above as he realized he held evidence that could topple governments and expose a century of legal colonialism. Outside, night security guards made their rounds, unaware that history was being rewritten in their basement archives. The weight of truth felt heavier than the concrete walls surrounding him. Meanwhile, in Bordeaux, Archivist Marie Du Bois had spent the entire night digitizing colonial administrator Henry Thomas's personal files, her elderly fingers working with urgency born from moral necessity. The documents revealed systematic genocide, forced labor, and resource theft that made modern corporate crime seem pale by comparison. Her scanner hummed steadily as she preserved evidence of villages burned, chiefs murdered, and children enslaved, all sanctioned by legal documents bearing the Thomas family seal. Dawn light filtered through archive windows as she uploaded everything to secure servers, knowing that powerful people would kill to keep these secrets buried. Her late husband had been a resistance fighter in Algeria, and she understood the price of silence in the face of injustice. The colonial files painted a picture of evil so systematic that even she, a lifelong historian, struggled to process the magnitude. In Switzerland, investigative journalist Kofi Asani had been tracking European financial flows to African mineral extraction for months when David's leaked emails landed in his secure inbox. Cross-referencing the communications with banking records revealed a web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and judicial bribes that connected London boardrooms to Ouagadougou carouses. His computer screen glowed in the Zurich hotel room as he verified each transaction, building an unshakable case of international conspiracy. The Thomas family's wealth, traced through Swiss banking records, showed direct correlation with African resource extraction and legal verdicts, favorable to European interests. His editor at The Guardian had already cleared front-page space for what would become the biggest corruption scandal in judicial history. As he typed his explosive expose, Kofi realized he was documenting not just corruption, but a systematic crime against humanity. At exactly 6 a.m. Greenwich Mean, synchronized releases hit every major news platform simultaneously. Leaked emails, colonial archives, and banking records forming an unbreakable chain of evidence. The Guardian's headline screamed, "Colonial Judge, Century of Corruption Exposed," while Leon revealed Thomas Dynasty, from colonial killer to corrupt judge. In days, David watched from his London flat as BBC breaking news showed crowds gathering outside the International Court demanding Judge Thomas's immediate arrest. Marie's colonial archives appeared on French television. Elderly survivors identifying their villages in photographs taken during forced relocations. Social media exploded as Dara colonial crime trended worldwide, with millions sharing evidence of judicial corruption spanning 4 generations. The carefully constructed facade of legal legitimacy crumbled in hours, replaced by undeniable proof of systematic criminality. Judge Thomas awoke to the shrill sound of his encrypted phone ringing at dawn. But this time the voice on the other end carried panic instead of confidence. "Thomas, the emails are everywhere. BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, they have everything." His mining consortium contact stammered, the smooth French accent now cracked with fear. Outside his London penthouse windows, he could see protesters gathering in growing numbers, their chants of colonial criminal rising like a thunderous storm. His hand shook as he scrolled through news headlines that demolished his reputation with surgical precision. Bank records, family documents, damning correspondence. The mahogany furniture that had symbolized inherited privilege now felt like prison, walls closing in around his crumbling world. His children's private school had already called, requesting immediate withdrawal due to security concerns and reputational damage. Within hours, emergency sessions convened in legal chambers across Europe as the judicial establishment scrambled to distance itself from the Thomas scandal. The International Court's Chief Justice announced a full investigation while privately ordering the immediate suspension of all Thomas family appointments. European mining stocks crashed as investors fled companies connected to the exposed corruption network, wiping billions from market valuations overnight. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré's phone rang constantly, with calls from African leaders offering support and international lawyers volunteering to represent Burkina Faso. The $500 million fine that had seemed insurmountable yesterday now appeared laughably illegitimate in light of documented judicial corruption. Swiss authorities froze Thomas family accounts as prosecutors prepared charges of money laundering and conspiracy. At the International Court building, security guards struggled to control crowds of journalists and protesters demanding immediate action against the corrupt judge. Court employees whispered nervously in hallways as investigators arrived to seize records and computers, their professional composure cracking under unprecedented scrutiny. Judge Thomas's nameplate was quietly removed from his office door as maintenance. Workers changed locks and security codes throughout the building. The marble corridors that had once echoed with his authoritative footsteps now buzzed with investigators documenting decades of criminal conspiracy. His judicial robes hung abandoned in chambers that would never again host his corrupted version of justice. The very foundations of international law were being examined and purified in real time. In Burkina Faso's presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré sat calmly with his advisors, watching international news coverage with the serene satisfaction of a chess master whose strategy had finally reached fruition. His intelligence services had been gathering evidence on judicial corruption for months, waiting for the perfect moment to expose the entire network. The $500 million fine had been the trigger he needed, an overreach so audacious that it forced the corrupt system to reveal itself completely. His phone displayed messages of support from presidents across 3 continents, each offering military, economic, or diplomatic assistance against colonial judiciary. The young revolutionary leader, who had been painted as a reckless upstart, was now being hailed as a strategic genius. As afternoon light streamed through palace windows, Traoré smiled, knowing that justice delayed had indeed become justice delivered through patience and perfect timing. 6 months after the infamous verdict, Ibrahim Traoré stood before a reformed international court where African judges now held majority representation for the first time in history. The same marble halls that had once echoed with colonial arrogance now witnessed true justice as Judge Amina Khan of Kivoire read the final ruling. The Thomas verdict is hereby declared null and void obtained through corruption, judicial misconduct, and crimes against humanity. Her voice rang with authority that centuries of oppression could not diminish. Behind bars in a London prison, former Judge Thomas watched the proceedings on a small television, his family fortune seized and distributed to African development funds. The $500 million fine had become a $2 billion reparation payment flowing from European mining corporations back to Burkina Faso's people. The courtroom erupted in celebration as justice finally found its rightful home in African hands. In Ouagadougou Central Square, hundreds of thousands gathered beneath the statue of Thomas Sankara to celebrate their president's vindication and Africa's judicial renaissance. Grandmother Aminata, now celebrated as a prophetess of justice, sat in a place of honor while her great-granddaughter Miriam addressed the crowd through a microphone. Our ancestor spirits guided us through darkness toward this day of reckoning, Miriam declared, holding high the piece of iron her grandmother had given her months earlier. The crowd's cheers echoed across the Sahel as children who had never known true sovereignty witnessed their continent's rebirth through legal liberation. Traditional drummers beat, rhythms that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of a free Africa, while elders wept tears of joy for justice long deferred. The red earth beneath their feet felt different somehow, as if the weight of centuries had finally lifted. Across Europe, the Thomas scandal triggered wholesale judicial reforms as governments scrambled to rebuild international legal credibility shattered by colonial corruption. Marie Du Bois received France's highest civilian honor for exposing crimes that academia had long suspected but never proven with such devastating clarity. David, the court clerk whose courage sparked a revelation, established a foundation dedicated to judicial transparency and African legal sovereignty. Swiss banks returned billions in stolen African wealth, while mining corporations faced criminal prosecutions that would reshape international resource law forever. The colonial judicial system that had operated in shadows for generations now faced the harsh light of accountability. European law schools began teaching courses on decolonizing justice as the old order crumbled beneath undeniable evidence. As the sun set over Burkina Faso's capital, President Ibrahim Traoré addressed his nation from the same palace balcony where Thomas Sankara once declared that a soldier without political education is a potential criminal. His words carried across radio waves to every village compound and city neighborhood, reaching hearts hungry for dignity restored. Today we prove that patience, strategy, and righteousness can triumph over centuries of injustice, he declared, his voice steady with quiet revolution. The mining wealth that had enriched European family for generations would now fund schools, hospitals, and infrastructure throughout West Africa. Children born on this day would grow up in a world where African dignity was protected by African law, enforced by African judges. The tables had not simply turned. They had been rebuilt entirely, crafted from the strong wood of justice and carved with the tools of truth. From a $500 million injustice to complete vindication, Ibrahim Traoré's story proves that truth always finds its way to light. Colonial corruption crumbled before African dignity and strategic patience. What did you think of this incredible reversal? Subscribe for more untold stories of African resilience and share your thoughts below.